Great. Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone that's joined us this afternoon. Good afternoon, and I guess good morning to our colleagues in Central and Western Canada. This is Stephen Carey calling from Ryerson University, and on behalf of the CAFCE Professional Development Committee, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first installment of our two-part webinar series called A Co-op for All, Fostering an Environment of Inclusiveness. In this webinar series, we'll be looking at ways that co-op practitioners and offices can make their programs more accessible for our students. I'd like to take a few moments to go over a few housekeeping items first, and then our agenda for today. First, we will be centrally muting all the telephone lines, including the presenter lines, centrally via the ReadyTalk software. And if anyone needs to take him or herself off mute, you just hit *7 on your phone to speak, and then *6 to mute again. And we'd like everyone to make sure that your line is muted if you're not calling with a question, just because with a lot of noise that comes in from different participants' offices, it makes it difficult to follow some of the presentations. So if you could just be cognizant of that, it would be appreciated. If you'd like to submit a question or comments, please do so using the chat box in the bottom left of the screen. For those of you joining us online, we'll cover those questions at the end of the presentation. All of our presenters will remain online for the duration of the webinar, and what we'll do is we'll go to questions at the conclusion of all of the formal presentations. We expect that today's webinar will be maybe an hour and 15 minutes duration. So we'll kick things off with an introduction to the topic from the CAFCE President, Marie-Claude Fannon, which will be followed by presentations from Marie-Claude Gagnon, an Accessibility Officer in the Human Rights Office at the University of Ottawa. And Marie's presentation will be followed by Philip Brown, who is the Assistant Director of Management Co-op at the University of Toronto Scarborough. And Philip had actually done a presentation at the CAFCE conference in Moncton last summer that sort of precipitated this webinar series. And that presentation was called Accommodating Students with Disabilities within the Co-op Framework. So that's the agenda for the afternoon, and I look forward to it and look forward to the questions from our participants. We'll kick things off by having Anne-Marie do an introduction to the webinar. Anne-Marie?
Great. Thanks so much, Stephen, for giving me a few minutes to introduce this topic and to share a few thoughts from CAFCE's perspective. At last year's annual general meeting, CAFCE members took an important step towards inclusivity in co-op by adding the following notation to the official definition of a cooperative education program. The cooperative education definition criteria are intended for program design and reflect the guiding principles of the Canadian Association for Cooperative Education accreditation requirements. CAFCE acknowledges and affirms the rights of students with disabilities to have equal access to cooperative education programming. Exceptions to the above will be supported to meet the duty to accommodate and to ensure that all students have full and equal access of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. This notation recognizes that in order to truly have a co-op for all, we must have a definition of co-op that recognizes and encourages exceptions to meet the unique needs of students with disabilities. And so our revised definition of co-op gives us an important starting point, but also one that leaves us with a number of unanswered questions. What exactly is our duty to accommodate? How far does it extend into the workplace? And where does the division of responsibility lie between post-secondary and industry? How can we work with our various disability counseling offices whose expertise often lies in classroom accommodation to ensure that students have the necessary supports while on work term? And last but not least, how can we support students with disabilities through the recruitment and employment phases of co-op when some of them are unwilling or unaware of the need to disclose for additional supports? Most of us are grappling with these questions at our individual institutions, devising new practices and processes to support an increasingly diverse student population. Our CAFCE community provides an exceptional venue to continue the conversation and share these best practices, learning from each other. As Stephen mentioned, last year at the Moncton Conference, our colleagues from the University of Toronto Scarborough shared their experiences with supporting students with disabilities. That presentation precipitated this webinar. We'll learn more about their experience today, and over the next 2 weeks, we as a community will have the opportunity to explore issues of access from a breadth of perspectives: employers, students, co-op offices, and accessibility experts. We hope to answer some of these questions and, most importantly, to keep this conversation going, highlighting the importance of inclusivity in our program design and operationalization. It's truly the only way that we will achieve our goal of a co-op for all.
Thank you very much, Anne. That's a great introduction to, great kickoff to the webinars. And we'll now turn things over to Marie-Claude Gagnon, who is the Accessibility Policy Officer in the Human Rights Office at the University of Ottawa. Marie-Claude?
I think you might still be muted, Marie-Claude. Did you hit *7?
Me? No, I didn't. Marie-Claude? Nicole?
Yep, I'm just sending her a message.
Yeah, okay. We apologize for the technical difficulties, folks.
Hello?
Hello.
Now we can hear you.
Okay, I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
there
I
we
was doing
go.
*7. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, so my name is Marie-Claude Gagnon, and I am the Accessibility Compliance Officer at the University of Ottawa. And yes, I'm here to talk about some of the accommodation requirements under the law. So today we'll just learn about some legislation on the workplace accommodations. Most of them are provincially regulated, but we'll do an overview of what it could be, and learn about the workplace accommodations, the rights and responsibilities of employees and employers, reasonable accommodations, and where's the line, the rights and responsibilities during a job interview, and I put some resources on Annex and the sources of the information here. First part is the legislation. So the Human Rights Codes, and I put this in broad because here we work on the Ontario Human Rights Code, but I know there are other ones obviously here. And the accessibility laws across Canada. Every province has their own Human Rights Code and accessibility laws. Some do not have mandatory accessibility standards as of now. And the accessibility standards and compliance timelines vary across provinces and within the province. And that means that it's something to think about when you're thinking about having somebody, let's say, to secure employment, let's say in a municipal area versus a federal or provincial, because the compliance may change, and that could be something to be mindful when you have, let's say, somebody who requires a wheelchair accessible place of work. And as for the Human Rights Code and the Canadian Human Rights Act, both legislate that the employers cannot discriminate against a person with disability and require employers to provide reasonable accommodations. Now, the Human Rights Code explains what the duty to accommodate is, and it addresses the discriminations of all the targeted groups, such as LGBT, disability, women, visible minority, and so on. So, by the way, for people who do have accessibility guidelines, like we do on Ontario, you cannot submit a complaint under the accessibility laws, but you can submit a complaint under the Human Rights Code. So it doesn't mean that because you're compliant with the accessibility, it does not shield you from human rights complaint from your duty to accommodate. So I'm going to look at the workplace accommodations. So what is a workplace accommodation? So it is a reasonable adjustment made in the interview process and in the workplace, allowing a person with a disability to apply for jobs and fully perform the duties, bona fide requirements of his position. And you'll see why I'm putting these things in the heavy character later. The objective is to help people reach the same outcomes as their peers and level the playing field. That means it doesn't have to change the outcome. It just needs to alleviate the obstacles in order for them to reach the same outcome. What is a bona fide occupational requirement? It's a legal term for the essential task required to perform a job. If an employer can establish a particular bona fide occupational requirement that cannot be modified, adapted for an accommodation, they may not have to accommodate a worker in that job. I could give an example. As an example, a person that do constructions work that requires to lift boxes, and even if you do need a lift, you still require to lift some things. And if a person has a severe back problems, then it may not be the kind of jobs that this person can do, and it is not required to accommodate that need. A bona fide occupational requirement are not preferences. They are duties or elements that are essential to the job. So some things could be nice to have, let's say working in 8 to 4, but some things are must have in order to accomplish the task. See, that's the example I had before, right? If you do or can perform the accommodation or not. So for some examples, a person that answered a phone in administrative work may have to be there between 8 to 4, but a person that do, let's say, web server may not have to show up between 8 to 4. So it really depends of the job and the essential requirements from the job requirements that requires. Rights and responsibilities. So this is where we put the co-op students' rights. The co-op students have the right to confidentiality under the law, so the supervisor cannot disclose disability without the student's consent. He cannot be treated less favorably than other employees without the disability, and for example, paying less, and need to receive reasonable accommodation upon request, up to the point of undue hardship, in a timely manner and without additional cost from the student. So that means that about the student's disclosure, a student do not have to disclose unless disability impact its ability to do the job or put safety of coworkers at risk. So that means if it links to the essential requirement of the employment, the person must disclose that he cannot perform this task. But if it's not, the student doesn't have to disclose. But he cannot expect an accommodation if it is not disclosed. So that's one of the things that students have to take into consideration. So students are not obligated to explain what the exact diagnosis is either, but they need to articulate their functional abilities and suggest workplace accommodations. So functional limitations or functional abilities are, for example, a person does not have to say that they have a mental illness, but if that mental illness requires for them to stay, let's say, in a quiet room, in an area that is quiet, then they can say, I need quiet. Now, they can suggest accommodations, but these accommodations are only suggestions, and we'll see that later. It is acceptable for the employer to ask for medical documentation for verification of abilities as they relate to their workplace. And again, we'll see what are the limitations on those later. The corp students has also some responsibilities to inform the employer of needs and requests of accommodations in order to be accommodated. They need to explain why the accommodation is required and relate to the job duties, and provide information regarding restrictions, including information from healthcare professionals. So they need to cooperate in order to be accommodated, participate in the accommodation process, and work with employers offer and try to propose solutions. Now, because some people may come with suggestions of an accommodations, and as an employer, you should try to reach as much that number one suggestions of accommodations, but we're not required. If it's not possible, we can find another way to accommodate the need. We're not required to, let's say, take the most preferable from the employee or the students in this case. So you discuss and propose solutions, and it's a discussion process, and then once you meet it, agreed upon performance and job standards once accommodation is provided. Other responsibilities. So the employer's responsibility, the employer needs to accept the employee's request for accommodation in good faith unless legitimate reasons for acting otherwise. It needs also to provide accommodation up to the point of undue hardship and obtain expert opinion or another health expert opinion when necessary. Also, the employer must maintain confidentiality, write an accommodation plan, and keep it in a secure place. Grant accommodation requests in a timely manner and cover related costs. And offer, and I have at the end in the annex some places where fundings can be found. Offer same opportunities as other employees without disabilities, and that also include promotions and everything like that. And take accommodation plan in consideration during job appraisal. Now, this is a new thing that came through, at least in Ontario, with the mental health-related needs. If mental health needs is apparent, employers have a legal duty to inquire and offer assistance. In that scenario, it is not required that the person ask in order to be accommodated. If it's a visibly apparent thing, the employer also has the responsibility to bring it up and suggest some support. There are different ways to come about this. They can say, as an example, work-related situations, like we can see we're having a hard time, accomplish this task. How can we help you better? We have resources. So that's those kind of things that could be asked without being too intrusive. The student is not required to share a diagnosis, only its functional limitations written by health practitioners. And again, health practitioners is not necessarily a psychiatrist or a licensed psychologist. It now includes social workers, general practitioners, and psychotherapists. Reasonable accommodations. It is reasonable accommodations must be duty related. That means it's linked to the task performed. We have the optimal versus practical. So, for example, if you find an ergonomic chair will solve the person's back problem, but that individual prefer a lifting hydraulic table, but it is more, it's a cheaper version that will meet the same need, the ergonomic chair will work better, then you're not obliged to offer the ergonomic table, for example. Or having a sign language interpreter versus closed captioning is another example, right? And all the accommodations must respect privacy, autonomy, and dignity. So an example would be having a chemical toilet that is accessible for a person in a wheelchair while everybody else have an indoor washroom. That would be considered not respecting the person's dignity, right? Or having somebody have to lift your wheelchair in order to cross stairs, that would not respect a person's autonomy. Undue hardship. There's 3 reasons under the law why undue hardship could be let's say mentioned. It's the cost, and that one is a very hard threshold to pass. I mean, this is it has to prove that the cost would actually put the company under bankruptcy. Then that will be considered a cost that would be a reason up to undue hardship. Health and safety. Let's say accommodating a person that would take a risk of of other people. Let's say a lab with chemicals, and somebody needs a service dog, a service animal. Well, we can refuse to allow a service animal in food preparation and labs because of health and safety, but we need to provide another type of accommodation. Now, if it's for the personal safe and safety of that individual has the right to decide whether or not it's safe for them to accomplish this task or not. We're not here to tell them we don't think it's safe for you to, let's say, perform this task because of your back. They're the one who can decide these things for themselves. Outside source of funding is available. That would be, for example, we do not need to, let's say, provide a wheelchair for a person, that person had outsourced source of funding that is available for themselves, so they can provide themselves these devices in order to get to work. Job interviews. During job interviews, there's some rights and responsibilities as well. People have the rights of a person with disability during a job interview. Employers are not permitted to ask discriminatory questions in interviews pertaining race, sex, religion, marital status, disability, and more. I think I put in annex examples of what to do and what not to do. The focus of the interview should be on your skills and abilities and whether you can perform the job or not. And yeah, that's it. I guess the rest you can see in the resources. I'm just going to go quickly here. Those are some resources, and the annex here, I put examples of what to ask or not to ask. And that's it. Whoops.
That's great. Thank you very much, Marie-Claude.
Okay.
And we will make these slides available. You're okay with us making slides available to the to our CAFCE members?
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh,
great.
great.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll have those available for everyone following the webinars. Okay, thank you very much. So, Marie-Claude, for giving us that sort of introduction to sort of the overall legal landscape. Next up then is Philip Brown, who is the Assistant Director of Commerce Co-op at the University of Toronto Scarborough. And Phil is going to give us sort of a reprise of the presentation he did at the Moncton Conference last year, talking about their journey through the process of evaluating the accessibility of co-op for their students. Phil, do you want to take it away?
Thanks, Stefan. I want to thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Yep, good. I'm making sure that works too. Yep. So thank you, Stefan, for asking us to present. I want to thank Anne-Marie and Marie-Claude also for their work today too. Just to start, some housekeeping before I get started. I'm actually joined, the presentation was three of us. It was myself, you can see the slide, Kathleen McDowell and Colleen Reed, who also work at the University of Toronto. They will be sharing the presentation with me as we did in Moncton. I'd like to also say that a copy of this presentation has been made available to Nicole, which is sort of just accessible version for anybody who might want or require it for future use. So I'll ask that Nicole can make that available, and we'll make that available, Stefan, with our own presentation at the end of our presentation.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you. Yep.
I guess we can start by just talking about what brought us here. The co-op practitioners, in partnership with the Campus of Accessibility Office, in this presentation will draw upon a recent case, and we're going to use it as a bit of a guide towards talking about our experience and lessons that we've learned and where we intend to move forward with our presentation. I won't do a bio for Colleen and Philip and Kathleen. They're on the slide in front of you, but maybe we can get started. We'll start passing along to Colleen for the next part of the presentation.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Colleen Reed. I'm the Associate Director of Accessibility Services here at UTSC. And here at the UTSC campus, we feel really honored to have such a great working relationship with our co-op colleagues, because I really strongly feel that it's in the partnership that we're best able to support students to success, both in their coursework as well as in their workplace experiences. So to get started, we just wanted to frame this and I'm sure that we're seeing this across Canada. I can certainly speak to it in Ontario. We are finding that enrollment of students with disabilities in post-secondary institutions is growing, and it's growing at a double-digit rate here at the UTSC campus. In the last 5 years, we have more than doubled in our student registrations for support services related to disability. We also know from studies that graduates with disabilities report that building experience through volunteer work, internships, work placements, and so on is really one of the most important pieces to a successful transition to the workplace. And I would venture to say that that is not unique to students with disabilities. I think in general, this is a key to success for many students. What we also know, however, is that students with disabilities are less likely to work while in college or university compared to students without disabilities. And a big piece of that can be that maybe students with disabilities have to take a reduced course load, and doing that and just focusing on their studies is enough. So to take on additional volunteer or work placements can be challenging. So co-op's really ideal in that way to provide this experience for students. So moving on to our next slide, we just want to talk about this partnership. In order to effectively accommodate a student or an employee, it is absolutely required that we partner with and everybody be engaged in the process, and that includes the student, of course. So at the post-secondary institution, if you don't already have strong connections with your student services, academic support offices, and your disability service office, I would say that would be priority number one in order to be working together and having a really open dialogue and structure in place to support students when they're going on work placement. The other piece is the student and the importance of working on self-determination, helping students build that skill, build self-advocacy, and understand how their lived experience is going to inform their how their accommodation needs as well as their experience in the workplace, much in the same way that it does at the university. And then finally, the employer. We are trying to put a lot of energy and focus into developing relationships with employers who already have strong accessibility policies, and for those who don't, to start that conversation and putting it on their radar that this is important and required, and we really want to engage employers that have that lens. So the benefits to focusing on inclusion for students, as I mentioned already, many times students don't have the opportunity to volunteer or work, so this is a great opportunity, having a work-integrated learning environment to address that issue. Also, as with all students, many students with disabilities indicate that they benefit from learning hands-on, so this is a great opportunity for them. It's also a wonderful, supported environment in which students can really explore how to request accommodations. It's an opportunity for them to develop those self-advocacy skills and have people there supporting them in doing so, as opposed to having to navigate that when they leave university. So that's a really wonderful benefit for them. And then again, you know, students with disabilities do have the potential to incur higher expenses and debts than students without disabilities, so being able to work during university is of great benefit for them as well. So in terms of the employer, I won't take too much time on this. We just really wanted to encourage institutions to engage their employers and recognize the benefits of accessing the skilled pool of candidates. Studies do show that there's a reduced turnover with employees with disabilities, that there is an improvement in employee engagement, and of course we need to comply with legislation. So we never like to go with it's the law first. We'd rather go with it's the right thing to do, but the reality is there are federal and provincial legislation in place to support this, and it is required. So, speaking duty to accommodate, Marie-Claude already covered this, so just want to echo what she shared. The big piece for the accommodation providers at the university is you must maintain confidentiality. And we need to ensure that the principles of accommodation are maintained, so it needs to be individualized. So what works for one student is not necessarily going to work for another. We need to be respecting dignity, and the focus needs to be on inclusion and full participation. So the one thing that I really want to emphasize is the importance of connecting with your disability service office when looking at accommodation planning, and with the representatives from the institution at which they're working, so at the business. If there's an HR rep who specializes in accommodation, it's imperative that you connect with those individuals prior to approving or denying any accommodation. You want the experts in there to guide that process. So we see the student as the expert, and you want to make sure that you're relying on your colleagues to support you in setting up the most appropriate accommodation plan for students. So again, this was covered by Marie-Claude, but factors in accommodation planning, it must always be individualized. Here we say essential course requirements. That's to reflect the course requirements within the co-op programming, but also this is the bona fide occupational requirements that Marie-Claude was speaking to. You want to have documentation. Documentation does not have to state the disability, but the restrictions and limitations. The two that I want to focus on is environment and lived experience. So it's absolutely imperative that we engage with the student in how they're experiencing their disability. Depending on the environment, it's going to present in different ways. There's going to be different barriers to the student depending on the task and the environment. So you really do need someone who's an expert and knowledgeable about the environment to be engaged in the accommodation planning process. So you have your DSO for the on-campus information. They can certainly also inform and make some suggestions and recommendations, but unless they really know the nature of the work and the environment, you're going to be missing a really important piece. So you need to engage the employer and have a really strong understanding of those bona fide essential criteria and what the job looks like. So when looking at that essential criteria, we want to ensure that all of our students have a rich work experience. We want to ensure that our students, when they graduate, that their degree has the same value as all of their peers. So we don't want to lower the bar. We just want to ensure that through accommodation, we're creating opportunity for students to show us what they can accomplish. So they're meant to level the playing field, not to compromise the bona fide requirements of the role. So when you're looking at barriers, we went into detail about this when we did this in Moncton during the summer, but what we want to look at is we want to look at certainly physical and architectural barriers. These are things you want to ensure that your workplace is physically accessible. But what's not always top of mind for some is to be looking at the other pieces in terms of, are there any barriers to accessing information? What about the technology? What types of resources are available to the student when they're on their job? Do they need voice-to-text software? Do they need a screen reader? These are all things that you want to be exploring. You want to be looking at policy and practice. CAFCE did that this past summer when looking at their accreditation standards. And so you want to ensure that we're always critically looking at all the things that we have in place for students and ensuring that there's no inadvertent barriers to students with disabilities. And of course, attitude is what informs all of those things. So these are the barriers we want to be considering when we're looking at supporting students in the work integrated learning environment.
Speaking about our experience again, we're going to just go through a bit of a co-op timeline. We'll walk you through our admissions process, the WTPC, which is something I think every university has some version of a work term prep course, some sort of preparatory thing before students go out on their job seeking. The job seeking process, the onboarding of our experience with onboarding, and the academic evaluation piece in this case. So looking at the recruitment selection, one of the things that we really realize is that students, we want students to apply to apply externally from high school. The reality is what we found out from students, both anecdotally and from other sources, was students were self-selecting. Students were looking at co-op and saying, here are the parameters of the program, 35-hour work week, 9 to 5, and saying, I won't do co-op. And I won't even apply to the program because I don't think it applies to us. We were a little surprised to hear that. So we realized that even in our recruitment and selection phase, in the admission phase, we were, students were self-selecting themselves out of the program. One of the things that we're trying to do now, with Colleen's help and guidance, we're putting together we've had a couple of meetings already, a lot of email going across to you in one full meeting, to incorporate equity statements into all our marketing materials. I mean, that is true for the University of Toronto proper, but that's not necessarily true for the co-op portion of what we're doing. Although we work closely with the DSO already, we're going to work even closer to help identify essential criteria and program potential barriers and full participation. The work term prep course. As you can see, it's an 8-month work term prep course, and it's a full-service thing. It's much of what you're all doing on your campus, I'm sure, and you can see some of the stuff that we're doing in the work term prep course. So we wanted to provide an 8-month work term for all students that met all students' needs and the criteria of our program. What we realized going through this process is that some of our in-class activities required movement, and that might be a barrier to many of the students who are already in our program. The curriculum doesn't address the whole person. We never had discussions. We never even broached the topic, whether it would be one-on-one or group situations about accommodation or any when to disclose and how to work with our accessibility, our DSO office, or any other partners on campus. So one of the things that we're trying to do is put universal instructional design is somewhat part of our program already, but we really need to drill through and go as deep as possible. We need to put as a piece of our program those discussion of strategies of accommodation for classroom and workplace environments. As you may know, Marie-Claude was great to talk about the mental health disabilities because that's not a visible one. So when we're talking about, it's very easy for us to look at somebody and say, oh, maybe we should have a conversation about that. But like many disabilities that our students may be dealing with, they're invisible. And so we must make it accessible for all of them. So we include opportunities for guided self-reflection during the work term prep course, whether that be family status, disability-related needs, or commuting, whatever that may be. And that's not all of the examples, but just a few. So seeking work. We went through a lot of different, this is probably the most difficult. I mean, it was all challenging to us, but lots of learning in here. So we had planned, there was almost 2 iterations of this, but to look at it simply in one timeline, we had planned students to access one-on-one meetings with coordinators to provide job search support. And we thought that was a nice plan. So the reality is we provided a set of weekly meetings for the students at regular times to make it easy for the students that we're dealing with. It was difficult. It was difficult to find a balance between doing and facilitating. As many of you may be aware, I think everybody I've met in co-op circles are compassionate people. And sometimes you start working with a student and you start taking over that one-on-one appointment and those things. So for us, it was finding that dividing line because we want the student to own this. This is about empowerment. This is not about us doing like Colleen said in the past. We're not trying to lower the bar for any students. We're just trying to accommodate those things. That remains a challenge, and that's something that with further education and more experience, I think that's something that we can overcome in the future. We started using Skype technology to meet with students because this particular student energy level was one of the effects of his disability, and we had currently not used Skype and that type of technology to meet with students. So one of the things that we found, or the recommendations, I guess you could say, is setting that clear boundaries of expectations. You know, sitting down, maybe even taking the first 2 appointments rather than accomplish anything to talk about, okay, where are we going to go? What's your responsibilities on this? And what am I going to do to help accommodate your needs in this situation? And talk about the use of technology. I don't expect that I know all the technological apps or things that are out there. Maybe we can discuss those things and bring in the DSO office where needed to discuss those use of those technologies. Okay, in terms of the networking events, is that the next slide there? I hope I didn't skip one. Yeah, students were planning to attend all networking. These are practice. Some of them were practice events, and some of them were actual networking events with employers. You know, maybe it's a small story. I promised I wouldn't tell stories, but I'm going to take a small story. One of the students requested exemption for the one-on-one meetings with employers, rather than going through the circle of death, as I call it, during networking events. Now, for us, we had to discuss amongst ourselves, is that a reasonable accommodation? Is there something that's outside of co-op? Because we wanted that student to have the co-op experience rather than provide something that we didn't provide to other disadvantaged other students who were in our program. So it was difficult to find where the line was. And even the time of the networking events. We don't think of it, but maybe early morning is not best for all networking events, and to provide opportunities depending on what the students' needs are. We want to make sure it's accessible to all students at all times. So as much as possible, providing advance notice of events and possibly extending time. If it's a 9 to 10 event, maybe we can go 10 to 11 where possible. or even later in the day, and consulting with the DSO office to identify what is appropriate accommodation, looking at our legislation and what is reasonable. So seeking work during the application process, this was also very difficult. So we plan to use existing partnerships with employers and firms that we worked with. We tried to provide what we considered to be a realistic approach to the seeking process. The reality is we were probably wrong the first time we went out. Okay, we thought employers would be all over this because much of their literature on their websites and our one-on-one dealings with employers couldn't wait to accommodate the students. That's not what we found. To varying degrees, we found individual champions. That is true. We found individual champions, but as a whole, we found the process. Hopefully, people can still hear me. Found it to be cumbersome. It was challenging to determine what would be realistic for all stakeholders. So this was really difficult, and we modified. The student went out for 2 separate work terms, one that was 4 months, one that was 8 months. The first work term started really, really late. It was quite difficult, and even the accommodation took about, I'm looking at Colleen, maybe about eight weeks in total, close to 6 to 8 weeks for them to actually put the computers in place. And this was a large firm with tremendous resources. So we were surprised by that. So the strategies, again, is start early. Speak to employers now about this. If you're not talking to your employers or engaging employers about these benefits of hiring students with disabilities, I would start now. Communicate. That we learned that as much as we thought we were communicating with others, there was always gaps in our communications. And chart that success and figure out what you've done well. Try to replicate those things. What we did well the second time is involve our business development unit very, very early in the process, and we kind of shifted everything forward as much as we possibly could. Finally, during the interviews, we were shocked. I can tell you, when we sent out, I don't mind saying this, to government agencies. We sent out our students for interviews with government agencies that didn't have ramps, that weren't accessible. We took a lot for granted because we didn't do necessarily site visits for the places where the students were going to be interviewed. We made a lot of assumptions on that part, whether it was accessible or not. So we found out quickly that in our interpretation of the interview that some employers had made up their minds before the interview started. Certainly the feedback that we got from the student was they felt that decision was made long before, as soon as they walked in and their disability was viewed, the interview was almost over. So, and the students were also unsure when to disclose. Do we put it on the resume? Do we put it on the cover letter? Do we tell them when they're going to the interview? We weren't sure, and the student wasn't sure. So these are all questions that were going through our minds. Some of the strategies that we'd like to employ in the future is prepare the student as much as possible and set realistic expectations. Know that some employers are very comfortable and some aren't as comfortable. It should not mean that you should be disadvantaged for the job. One of the questions we ask now that ensure the location of the interview is accessible. It seems like it was obvious, but it was not obvious to us or the employers at the time. And going through that decision to disclose in greater detail and involving the DSO and the co-op and raise the topic in advance to provide as many resources as possible. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer in terms of duty to disclose, but knowing that it's an individual choice as long as the student knows that they can or they cannot and what's reasonable to them.
So hi there, I'm Kathleen McDowell. I'm one of the student development coordinators here at UTSC. I'm just going to continue on with what Philip was saying and talk about while the students are on work term. So similar probably to what most of you do within co-op is you have the onboarding, they have the regular work activities. We do a midterm site visit where we physically come in to meet with the supervisor and the student, and then they finish up their work term for the remaining months. And then at the end of that, they have an academic responsibility with another evaluation, and the academic responsibility is a work term report. So we found that we had a plan of just having this student hired. Obviously, we were working with the DSO, and we wanted to accommodate with certain areas that were necessary. But as Philip mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the communication for the first work term that one of our students went on was extremely slow, and we took that for granted, I think, at the beginning. We thought because they were a company that was looking to hire people with disabilities that it would not take very much time, but unfortunately it did take over 6 weeks for that assessment, for the workplace assessment to be completed. So the student was hired in September, and they didn't even start work until about the first week of November. So it did make the work term a little bit shorter, obviously, than we wanted, but at the same time, it was quite a big waiting game. But that, of course, made it a good opportunity for us to learn, and we've learned since then. And with the student's second and third work term, it was early communication and really making sure that we were involving even earlier the DSO office, as well as being realistic with our timelines and with the student and their timelines. So while on work term, the first time out, the student, of course the goal is to have every student have meaningful work, just like, and all students have that. But unfortunately, there was something that went wrong where the employer was really not able to provide that meaningful work to the student. And, whether that be that they didn't know what they were capable of, or they were nervous to give them certain work. But unfortunately, later on, we learned from the student that the work was really not. He felt that he was underused, and that he really didn't get the work that was meaningful for him. So once again, it's that communication ahead of time with the DSO, but also with the employer as well, to really make sure that the work is going to be valuable for that student, and understanding what their capabilities are. For this student, they had very high capabilities of doing certain work, and unfortunately he was underused in that work term. But in subsequent work terms, the student received an extension because he did such an amazing job. So that was a success for the second time around. So the academic responsibilities while they're on work term, there is a work term report that the students must do at the end of each work term. Probably similar to what many of your students do as well. And this has to be completed as an assignment. Obviously, the plan always was to have the same time, everything the same as what other students had outlined. But in reality, we realized because the energy level was lower, because there were certain, barriers for this student, that we needed to look at additional time, and we needed to provide some additional flexibility. And so as long as, once again, it's not diluting the degree, that was the main thing for us, that, one of the requests was not to do the report, but that wasn't an option, because really there were accommodations that could be made, just as any other courses and assignments that they would have at the university. There was opportunities for us to make accommodations on this, but still have the student complete the actual work term report. And of course, the evaluation where the employer evaluates the student. This was, once again, we wanted it to be exactly the same as what all other students require and receive. But what we found in reality is that sometimes there's preconceived notions, and I think that this is maybe a little similar to when Philip spoke about the interview, that as soon as they're seen, or as soon as they understand what the disability is, unfortunately with the evaluation, the preconceived notions provided more of a halo effect. And so was the actual evaluation accurate? Definitely in the subsequent work term it was, because there was an extension received by the student to continue working at the place of business, which was amazing. But it is really important for strategies to be clear with all those stakeholders that there is certain areas of the outcomes and the evaluations that we want to maintain that existing standard, and once again not dilute the degree or the experience for the student. So, excuse me, one of the concerns that you frequently hear from employers is the cost, and the concerns about the cost of accommodation. And what we found to be true, and this is stated through a lot of studies too that are available, is that accommodations in the workplace are seldom expensive. Oftentimes they cost under $500, and many cost nothing at all. So, when we're looking at accessibility requirements, yes, putting in an automatic door opener is an expensive venture, but that's not a requirement for the job, that's a requirement for the built environment. So that needs to be in place anyway. When we're looking at individualized accommodation, many of them don't cost anything at all. So that's something to really reinforce with any employers or prospective employers that you're working with. Some examples of workplace accommodations might be assistive technology. Many times students are very familiar with their, especially now, students are so well versed in the technology that's out there. With the resources available to all employees now, many times it's not an add-on, it's not an accommodation, it's just readily available. But for those who require assistive technology, that's something we want to explore. It might be that the employee needs to record instructions from their supervisor at meetings. Maybe they need a digital recorder just for that note-taking piece. So again, doesn't cost a lot, but can be very, very impactful for the student. If the employer can give a written copy of instructions or perhaps some flexible work scheduling, this is one of the barriers that we experienced the first time around. The student required a reduced work week due to disability-related needs, and that was a new thing to navigate in the co-op world for us anyway on this campus. But it can be done, and it should be done in many cases. So that was something that was important to explore. Allowing a self-paced workload, frequent breaks, extra time. And dividing larger tasks into smaller ones. So as you can see, a lot of these are minimal in terms of cost, but can be very impactful for the employee. So we wanted to leave everybody with just some tips that you can reflect on at your institution. The first and foremost, as a co-op office, to champion a culture of inclusion with the internal and external stakeholders. If this is front of mind and one of the things that you're talking about with all employers, don't wait until a student with a disability-related need comes for the interview. Talk about it from the outset so that culture has already been created. The other one is strengthening campus partnerships. Collaborate with your disability services office if you're not already doing so. We've instituted training for our co-op offices on a regular basis so that learning and dialogue is always happening, and I think it's been really helpful on all sides of the table. Actively engage employers who already have existing equity and inclusion policies and practices. And as we mentioned earlier, sometimes even if they do, they haven't had the opportunity to put them into practice. So working with them on that. And I've already mentioned the training for the co-op staff. Create a welcoming environment. You can do all these things and say you're welcoming, but if you're not using inclusive language, if you don't have accessible documents readily available, you noted that Philip at the beginning of our presentation indicated we do have a rich text format presentation ready to go for anybody who needs it. We try to eliminate the need for the requests. If a student sees it's already available to them, it's going to go a really long way to make them feel welcome. Wherever possible, build flexibility into the program. So working with the instructors on the work term deadlines, on timelines, work with the DSO on accommodation planning, and talk about the Disability Services Office frequently throughout your interactions with students. I really think a big piece that Philip mentioned earlier is weaving it into your course, the work term prep course piece, or your one-to-one meetings without being asked. Mention it. Talk about what your accommodation needs might be, even if the student's not presenting with a disability. You want to be thinking about their lived experience and just raising it as something that's part of everyday planning. And do not approve or deny any accommodation requests. I mentioned that earlier. This is really imperative. Before you do anything, you need to consult to ensure that you're on the right track. Once you've approved something, it's really hard to claw back if it wasn't the appropriate route to go. And also, you need to be very careful about denying accommodations because you want to ensure that we're meeting the students' needs and that we're meeting the legislation and the code that we're all guided by. Ensure that all disability-related information is kept confidential. If you're working with a student who has disclosed, you should have a process in place with confidentiality agreements already ready to go. You want to get those things signed before you start consulting with colleagues and other offices. It's really, really important that that be part of your process. So have that ready to go at the outset of the cycle. And never forget that, and I don't think this is even an issue from what I know about co-op colleagues, is that you have to be student-centered. The student has to be central to everything that we're doing and needs to be engaged in every step of the process. So what we've done is we've added some resources for you, and our contact information is there if you have any questions. I noticed that some of these resources, the Job Accommodation Network, for instance, was also listed on Marie-Claude's slide, so that those links might be of interest to you. Another piece that we added was we put in a video, which we won't show. It's about a 16-minute video. This is called A Higher Awareness, and it just might be of interest to some of you. This was launched as a national strategy for improving employment awareness, disability employment awareness. They have an awareness month now in October, and this video was launched to raise awareness about it, and it's really designed to inspire CEOs and decision makers in business to look at this untapped market of individuals with disabilities. So that might be something that you might be interested in watching and maybe using when you're doing your outreach and education to your stakeholders on campus.
All right. I think that concludes our presentation. Thanks, Colleen and Kathleen. Stefan, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right.
Thank you very, very much to all three of you for the presentation, for sort of reprising that for us. I think that was great. One of the things that struck me, I remember when I saw your presentation last summer, was just all of the pieces that are involved, right? And the importance of communication and getting the right people involved in the process. But I think it's very valuable, and I think that's you provided some great discussion points for our audience. At this point in time, we would like to open the floor up for questions. We do have one question in the chat already. And we'll monitor that a little bit, and we'll get to that question first, and then if any of our guests are interested in having it or posing any further questions, please feel free. Again, you can do that through the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of the interface. So the first question we have, and I think this pertains to both presenters or both groups of presenters. So Marie-Claude, I think you can chime in here as well. And it comes from Christine Dawson, and Christine is at Conestoga College, and Christine asks, what about accommodations in the interview process? I think, Marie-Claude, you'd made some reference to that in your initial presentation, just sort of at a surface level, but can you go a little bit further there? Nicole, do we have Marie-Claude with us?
I don't hear her. Let me just check.
Yeah. Okay. Perhaps not.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
yep.
So this is Colleen Reed speaking. Maybe when we're waiting for Marie-Claude to come back on, I can start.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Colleen. I think that'd be great. Yeah, thank you.
So in terms of the interview process, Philip mentioned this, that it is very individualized, and you need to have a fulsome conversation with your student about what it means to disclose and when it's most appropriate to disclose, and that is going to be different for every person. So one of the things that we've put in place here on this campus for all students, not just students in co-ops, is we created a webinar that's on our Career Center's website for students with disabilities, and it goes through the idea of disclosure, the considerations that they need to be thinking about to determine when and if they need to disclose. Sometimes it can be a real benefit. Certainly if it says in the job posting that they're looking for an individual, for instance, if the CNIB, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, is looking for somebody with lived experience, then yeah, that's something you'll want to disclose right on the application if they've indicated that's something they're looking for. So that's the one piece with disclosure. In terms of accommodations during the interview, sometimes it says as small as, just saying that I need to take notes, and it doesn't necessarily require a disclosure of disability. It's just saying, giving them some context. But there are times when it's appropriate, and that's something that because it's so individualized, I would encourage the student to talk to their disability service office in conjunction with co-op practitioners to figure out what's required and when they're most comfortable to disclose that, and again, how to start that advocacy discussion, how to position it.
Yeah. Okay.
When you do it too, it's important to know what you need and to frame it in a positive way for the employer so they can see where the benefits can be.
Okay, great. Christine, if you're listening, do you want to unmute your phone, or is there anything else? Have we answered your questions with respect to that?
I think she may have to run for the board meeting, but
yeah, okay.
I can pass that along to her.
All right, for sure. Okay. Do we have Marie-Claude on the line at all? It doesn't sound like it. So maybe if we have enough time, we can kind of loop back to that question again if there's any more interest there. Let's go on to the second question we have, and this comes from Colleen Phillips-Davis, and Colleen's at the University of Waterloo. And Colleen's question is, do you offer this service to recent grads within 2 years of graduation, a critical time for finding post-secondary university or post-university employment? And I assume when she says this service, I mean, I would assume this is something that pertains to you, Colleen, in terms of what you guys are providing?
Yes, so in terms of the University of Toronto at Scarborough, the Career Services Office does continue to provide services to students for 2 years post-graduation, and that includes networking and resources and so on. In terms of the Disability Services Office, we do transition planning with students, and we do workshops as well, and those are offered while the student is registered. At this time, we've got a fulsome transition program into university, and we've been really focusing our attention now on that transition out of university. So we do a lot of work with students in that last year of their program, preparing them to go out into the work world, but we're looking at further developing that programming. But so the short answer is yes. At the university, we do have it for 2 years post-grad, but we're continuing to look at how we can further develop that as well, specifically through the DSO.
Okay, great. And Colleen, if you're listening and would like to add to that, or if you have some, you want some further clarity, if you can unmute your phone, and I don't know if you need any more. No? Okay then. Moving on, we have another question from Chen Feng Huang at Concordia. And her comment and question is, she says, we see more and more students with mental health available for them.
Okay, so that's a broad question. Speaking earlier to the individualized nature of the accommodation planning, it really depends on how the student is managing their anxiety, what the triggers are, and so on. So what we often find is students who experience anxiety maybe in the academic environment, in the lecture theater and so on, they're not experiencing it in the same way necessarily in the workplace because of the nature of the work and the interactions and so on. So this would be something that, again, I would strongly encourage you to connect with your Disability Services Office. If the student's not already connected with the Disability Services Office, encourage them to do so because they can then talk to the student about their lived experience. They can collect the documentation that reflects the restrictions and limitations and come up with some recommendations. Many times it's developing strategies and resources for the student. So it's not necessarily accommodation. Maybe the approach is skill building supports. That's not to say that skills and building those strategies will replace the need for accommodation, but oftentimes you need both of those things in order to support the success of the student.
Yeah.
And if I can add really quickly, I'm currently working with a student who is dealing with anxiety issues. It stems from distance away from her home, how far the job would be away from, and many co-op offices have an expectation that students be engaged in a job search, whether that be appointments or applications or whatever standard you need to measure those engagements. What I've been doing with the students and saying is, okay, well, let's look at your locus. I know you're working on these things, and I know you're getting help for these things, but if you can only apply to jobs in this area, let's look at jobs in these areas. So it's the idea of, yes, there are standards, but even within those standards, I'm not going to ask her to apply to a job 4 hours away that requires a lot of possibly relocation or a lot of transportation, because that is, as Colleen said, that would be a trigger for her. So sometimes it's negotiation and sitting down and thinking about, okay, what's realistic without violating any of your standards of what's in your program.
And that's where it's such a great opportunity during the work term prep course, if you do have that in your program, to talk about those things, because again, that's not unique to individuals with disabilities. Maybe somebody is a single parent, or maybe has a lot of responsibilities in supporting their siblings in the home because of the cultural makeup of their family. So these are all relevant things to students across the board. So if you're talking about it early, if you're encouraging students to think about these things before they're getting out there to start with their applications, it may reduce even the need for them to disclose, period, because they're already thinking about these things and kind of framing how they're approaching things.
Yeah. Phil, if I can follow up a little bit on a couple of on your comments and also Colleen's, in terms of, I would assume from some of your discussions you're having with students that there's also some expectation management that's required as well, right? Given if there are sort of limitations like that student you're talking about, obviously if that student can't get to or has issues with being away a significant distance away from home, then that restricts the student's opportunities in some sense. Isn't that so?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it will. But we're looking at the whole individual here, and that, trying to make sure that all call is about dealing, as far as I'm concerned, is the growth of the individual. And looking at their locus of growth. But yes, you're right.
Yeah. Okay. We have a fourth question, and it comes from Jessica Wright. I'm not sure what institution Jessica's with, but the question is, when do you advise the student to inform the employer about required accommodations? Is it at the application stage, the interview, the offer?
Okay, so again, that's very individual, depending on the need. Certainly, if there's a essential criteria of the role, then we need to be looking at that early. This is where really the student really needs to have a strong understanding of what their limitations, restrictions are, and as was mentioned by Marie-Claude earlier, some ideas about so what works for them. And then we can help support from there as to what to request and when to request it. We can only make recommendations. What we do is we talk through with the student the pros and cons of doing it at each phase, and then the student needs to make an informed decision about what they're comfortable about. Again, giving the opportunity for the student to develop these skills now as opposed to when they're in a less supported environment after they've graduated. So I hate to not have an answer for you, but the answer is it depends, and it really involves consultation.
Just wondering, Nicole, do we have Marie-Claude on the line now? Or sorry, Marie-Claude, sorry?
I don't think she dialed back in, no.
No, okay. All right, just wanted to double check that. Let's see if there are any other questions. So those are the questions we have at this point in time. It's now 10 after 1, so we're about where we figured that we would finish the presentation. I'll allow another minute or two for one or two more questions if there's anything from the audience. If we have any people on the line that aren't online and maybe they have a question that they want to pose by phone, if they want to just hit *7, you can just join in the conversation by telephone if that's easier. Okay. Well, not hearing any further questions and not seeing any further questions coming through the chat, I think we will close it there for today. On behalf of the PD committee and on behalf of everyone that was involved in the call this afternoon, would like to thank Anne Fannon from CAFCE, Marie-Claude from the University of Ottawa Human Rights Office, Phil and Kathleen from UTSC Commerce Co-op, and Colleen from University of Toronto Scarborough Disability Services Office for their presentations today. Really appreciate it. I think it was some great information and certainly gives us a nice springboard into the second webinar. And we'll encourage everyone to join us for that one, which is Tuesday, March the 28th, and that will be at 12 noon Eastern Daylight Time again. In that event, as you can see on the presentation slides, we'll have Lisa Kelly from Canadian Business Sensibility, and they're a group that works with businesses to provide resources and support for businesses transforming into inclusive workplaces. We'll have Tim Rose, who is a diversity and disability advocate, and he will be discussing sort of the lived experience for a student with disabilities and the challenges involved in securing employment and how Co-op can hopefully help with that. And then finally we'll have Francis Vauclair, who's a recruiter from Sodexo Canada, providing an employer's perspective on this. So we look forward to having everyone join us. That's next Tuesday again at noon Eastern Daylight Time. So thank you very much to our presenters. Thank you very much to our audience this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you next week.